It's my great pleasure today to welcome everyone here to this special session. Some background to start with. So for each performance science symposium, one graduate paper award winner is selected by the scientific committee to give a keynote address. Submissions are reviewed for their originality, their interdisciplinarity, their importance, and their clarity. And this year there were 42 submissions. And the winner, of course, is our keynote speaker today, Tuula Jääskeläinen. Before I introduce her more formally, just a few notes about the format of today's session. So the presentation will last about 45 minutes, and that will be followed by a question and answer period of about 10 minutes, giving you enough time to get to whatever's next on your day. Please keep your mic muted. You'll see that we're recording the session today. And in the Q&A period, I think it perhaps works best for people to pose their questions verbally for those who have trouble reading the screen in the chat or perhaps are joining by phone. So when we get to that part, I'll invite you to either raise your hand or just indicate in the chat that you have a question, and then I'll ask you to unmute and pose your question or comment. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce the 2021 recipient of the Performance Science Graduate Paper Award, Tuula Jääskeläinen. Tuula has over 20 years of experience working in higher education administration and currently works as a planning officer at the Aalto University School of Arts, Design and Architecture. She's also a doctoral candidate at the Sibelius Academy at the University of the Arts in Helsinki, where her research focuses on experiences of studying arts education. Today, Tuula's paper is titled Music Students' Workload, Stress, and Coping in Higher Education, Evidence-Based Policymaker. Thank you, Tuula.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I'm very grateful for this graduate award, ISPS Graduate Award, and for the opportunity to give a talk to you about my research. I have been pursuing my doctoral studies while also working full-time. I have worked over 20 years in higher education administration, as you just heard, and I'm also a teacher. Thus, as a student, a teacher, and an administrator, I have multiple perspectives on my research topic, which is music students' experiences of their workload in higher education. I will start my presentation by clarifying this topic. I will then give an overview of the music student workload project. I will then review the 7 sub-studies that comprised the project, and I show how I triangulated the results to build a meta-narrative. I will conclude this presentation by providing policy and intervention recommendations that support students in coping with workload and stress in higher music education. In my research, I'm interested in all aspects of music students' workload during their years of study, both negative aspects such as burnout and positive aspects such as flow. They are considered to be workload components in my research. I'm particularly interested in the quality of music student workload and its consequences. However, research-based findings regarding students' experience workload are still lacking to a great extent in higher music education, although music students face various field-related physical and psychological demands in their studies. Therefore, I am investigating how the students themselves conceive and perceive their workload and their experiences of it. I think that research on students' experiences of their studies can provide knowledge that may be valuable for making decisions that have an impact on the academic community. By viewing music students' experience workload as a very human phenomenon, an everyday issue and a result of educational arrangements and inequalities, it is possible to lighten the load on music students' shoulders and to address concerns about workload in higher education practices and policies. To better understand what experience workload is about, let's listen to music students' lived experiences. The first experience here is about a music student's coping with the workload. I think money is one of the biggest issues. If there were more funding for students at these sorts of institutions, there wouldn't be that financial gap between those who have it and can put all that time into performance and practice, and those who have not, who have to try to squeeze it in around everything else. This second experience is about workload relating to the teaching and learning environments in the field of music. But it's fitting in the rehearsals around those things. So you have, as a musician, as well we have, the academic classes that everybody else has, but then we also have lots of performances and repertoires, which are just like classes, but are things that the other schools don't have. And it's not a lot, but then when you start adding in practicing on top of that, and ensembles, and if you get gigs, it all starts to add up very, very quickly. This third experience is about music student workload in their interaction with teachers. Some teachers are very good, but some teachers do not fit with me. I have teachers who everybody knows treat students in a harsh way. I think that almost all teachers are unaware of how much workload there is in studying for a degree. Almost nobody of the teachers wants to be flexible in their own subject and their ambitions for teaching. The teaching is mostly at the high quality level, but it's based on inhumanities. I have explored the subject of music students' workload, stress and coping in my article-based dissertation, which is comprised of 7 sub-studies. These sub-studies were part of the music student workload research project. In a happy coincidence, this project actually started at the ISPS 2017 conference in Reykjavik. I and my principal supervisor, Dr. Guadalupe Lopez-Inquest, had a poster about a literature review of music students' workload for my dissertation. And Professor Jane Ginsburg saw the poster and invited me as a doctoral exchange student to the Royal Northern College of Music in the United Kingdom. 1 year later, I found myself with my suitcase on an aeroplane. On my way to Manchester, after the exchange study period, I returned once again to the United Kingdom to collect data. Such lovely study experiences. Thank you, ISPS. Without that poster presentation at the Reykjavik conference, I probably would not be here today presenting my graduate award paper. So here you can see the 7 sub-studies in the project. The first one is a theoretical study, then there is a systematic review, 1 methodological study, and then 4 different kind of empirical studies. After I had finished these sub-studies, I looked at how their results and findings informed policy recommendations. Then I triangulated these sub-studies to create a meta-narrative of their policy recommendation. This meta-narrative started with the combination of 4 empirical sub-studies. Then it continued with the systematic literature review, and after that with the combination of theoretical and methodological sub-studies. It was important to base this meta-narrative on the empirical results and findings regarding music students' lived experiences. This provided the possibility to strengthen music students' voices when aiming for policy recommendations in order to better support music students with their experiences of workload, stress, and coping in higher education. Next, I will present these sub-studies and their policy recommendations one by following the order of this meta-narrative. In the first empirical mixed method sub-study, which I conducted together with my supervisors, Dr. Guadalupe Lopez-Iniquez and Dr. Kai Lehikoinen, the research question was, how do professional students in higher music education experience workload and stress? And how do they make use of proactive coping styles? The assessment instrument, the workload, stress, and coping questionnaire, was created by combining and adapting sections from 2 validated questionnaires from the learning sciences. The first instrument was the standardized study workload and stress section of the Learn questionnaire used in the Finnish higher education context. The second instrument was the proactive coping inventory for adolescents. It was developed in Canadian higher education. The workload, stress, and coping questionnaire also included demographic items and open-ended questions about workload, stress, coping, and the students' interactive experiences with teachers. The workload scale assessed students' workload experiences when considering studies as a whole in their main subject or principal studies. For example, one example of item, I must work very hard with my main subject studies. Then a single item assesses students' current feelings of experience stress. The proactive coping section included 7 different scales assessing proactive coping styles. For example, one example of item, I plan my strategies to change the situation before I act. They were proactive coping, reflective coping, strategic planning, preventive coping, instrumental support seeking, emotional support seeking, and avoidance coping. I also conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews, and the topics consisted of questions that encourages students to reflect on their workload, stress, coping as professional students in higher music education. The data was gathered online during the spring term 2019. We randomly selected 7 university-level music institutions in Finland and the United Kingdom, and a total of 155 music students from 5 different institutions completed the questionnaire. 29 music students participated in the interviews. The total response rate was relatively low, 9% in Finland and 1% in the United Kingdom, which is quite common for online surveys among students because of the survey fatigue they are typically exposed to. I analyzed the questionnaire data with SPSS using frequency statistics. I used Atlas TI to code and analyze the qualitative data concerning the answers to the open-ended questions in the questionnaire and transcribed interviews by following the analytical process of transcendental phenomenology. Here you can see that sorry. Here you can see the integration of qualitative findings with the quantitative results. The results indicate that there are statistically significant differences among music students. For example, here is concerning experience workload. In the music education genre group, students experience more workload than in classical music. And in study programs, the students in church music experience more workload than students in classical piano. With the experience stress, female students experience more stress than male students. And other genders, those students experience more stress than classical music students. And in composition and doctoral studies, students experience more stress than in classical piano. What comes to proactive coping styles, in the proactive coping scale, male students use proactive coping more than female students, which is interesting because female students experience more stress. And then in the emotional support seeking coping scale, male and female students use that coping style more than non-binary gender students, which is an interesting question. Why non-binary gender students don't use emotional support seeking? And it became evident that music students' study workload is a significant predictor of stress. However, proactive coping and strategic planning can be used to reduce this stress because they predict stress negatively. And then professional music students have their own issues and ways to cope with workload and stress concerning, for example, competing with peer students and finding support for music-specific physical and psychological problems. Here you can see an example of a music student's experience in using an emotional support-seeking coping style. I got peer support from the other students. You hear that very many of your peer students have also had enormous stress. It has been very encouraging to notice that people also talk openly to each other about these issues. And also, for example, recommend to each other that there is this kind of study counselor where you can go. The policy recommendation arising from this sub-study is that studying music has its unique characteristics compared to other fields in higher education. And exploring professional music students' particular ways of using proactive coping styles could result in valuable models for students to better cope with their studies in higher music education. Because I have been researching this workload, you can imagine how much tips I have learned from the participants. And that's why I have been able to manage to do so much things during my doctoral studies because of these good tips with the workload. Here you can find details of the forthcoming article, which is under review at the moment. Let's hope we can see it soon published. In the second empirical mixed method sub-study, which I conducted together with my supervisors, Dr. Guadalupe Lopez-Iniquez and Dr. Michelle Phillips, the research question was, what are the predictors and determinants associated with students' experiences of workload in relation to their livelihoods and stress in higher education? We used the same data as in the first sub-study, but now, in addition to the workload and stress scales, we look at the participants' responses related to the working, funding, and loan items, as well as sociodemographics. I analyzed the quantitative data with RStudio by using Bayesian mixed effects ordinal profit regression modeling to estimate the effects of countries and livelihoods as predictors for music students' experience workload in relation to their main subject of study or principal study and stress. As I mentioned in the first sub-study, the response rate was quite low. When dealing with small samples and missing values that create gaps in the data, Bayesian statistical modeling is a good option because it can provide valid results under these conditions. When considering a mixed methods approach, one advantage of Bayesian statistical modeling is that it can build links between quantitative and qualitative data. Thus, the mixed methods approach, which I utilized in this study, may offer a valuable model of how to utilize students' feedback in the most beneficial way to feed into developmental work in universities and educational policies. Here you can see the full model of music students' experience main subject workload, which indicates, if you look at the red boxes, that, when connected to these characteristics of livelihoods, stress was here, was the strongest predictor of workload. There was also an effect for funding here, such that music students with partial funding or no funding at all were less likely to experience workload, which is surprising, than students with full funding. Work related to music here had a greater effect than work not related to music. But the total amount of work undertaken alongside a student's studies had a negligible effect on workload. Female music students were likely to experience more workload than male or non-binary gender students. The level of the university studies in general had a relatively small impact on the results. However, undergraduate music students were likely to experience more workload than postgraduate students or junior and doctoral students. The music genre studied had little influence on the level of experience workload, although studying music education had a greater effect compared to other genres, whereas the classical music genre had a negligible effect. And then here you can see the full model of music student experience stress. The previous one was workload, but now we look at stress, which indicates with the red boxes that when connected to the characteristics of livelihoods, music students in the United Kingdom are more likely to experience stress than music students in Finland. Workload was the strongest predictor of stress in the full model, There was also a noticeable effect for gender, such that female music students were more likely to experience stress than male students. With the non-binary gender, there was a positive effect on stress, which was contradictory to the negligible effect on workload in the previous full model. So non-binary gender students experience stress, but they don't experience workload. Both work not related to music and the total amount of work undertaken alongside studying had a small effect. But work related to music did not have an influence on stress. So music students, if they work with music, that doesn't affect their stress. Junior or doctoral music students were much more likely to report stress than postgraduate students or undergraduate students, which contradicts the full workload model, in which being an undergraduate student had more influence on workload. What is interesting is that the use of student loans had no effect on stress or workload. Here you can see an example of a music student's workload experience relating to teaching and learning environments. But contact teaching is sometimes very hard if the allowed amount of absences is strict. Unfortunately, many students have to work both for their prestige and CV, for their artistic career, or to earn extra income, although working is not recommended whilst studying. And the policy recommendation arising from this sub-study is that attention should be paid to certain aspects in higher music education in relation to workload, such as the differences between study programs and the gap between well-off students compared to low-income students who need to work, and stress, particularly with female and non-binary gender students. And here you can find details of the published article in the journal Music Education Research. Then in the third empirical sub-study, which I conducted together with my supervisor, Dr. Guadalupe Lopez-Iniquez, the research question was, what constructive tools for teachers can support music students in managing and coping with their workload in higher education? We used the same qualitative data as in the previous sub-studies. Based on music students' experiences, 4 themes emerge in the synthesis process as recommendations for tools for teachers to support music students. The findings included a total 43 recommendations, and next I will show you one example of these recommendations for each theme. Teachers should obtain more knowledge about the whole structure of workload in studying music in higher education. Studying in higher education brings along overlapping schedules and performance anxiety for music students, particularly at the bachelor level. Research-based evidence on music students' experiences could help teachers better understand students' multifaceted circumstances with workload in their studies. Teachers could best support students' approaches to learning by treating them as autonomous individuals. Students also need clear advice from teachers, for example, with technical aspects in practicing. Instead of the traditional master apprenticeship model, where teachers have an authoritative role, Students would like to receive advice in a learner-centered way. It's important for teachers to understand that students have mostly positive learning experiences in the teaching and learning environments. But some students have suffered unfortunate, unfavorable, or even abusive behavior from their music teachers, and these experiences may affect students' current workload. It's important to teach students in higher education how to deal with stress, because too much stress is often connected to overload, and it affects most aspects of the student's physical and mental health and can even lead to burnout. And here you can see an example of an experience in music students' workload in interaction with teachers. Even if you were not prepared well for that lesson, or even if you were extremely well prepared, that does not matter, because when the teacher is motivated and interested in teaching you and listening to you, then you as a student are ready to work hard for learning. The policy recommendation arising from this sub-study is that the emphasis on music students' workload experiences could offer a way to strengthen students' voices so that they will be integrated into the development of teaching that trends towards more democratic practices between master and apprentice in higher music education. And here you can find details of the manuscript, which will be submitted for publication next month. In the fourth empirical sub-study, the research question was, what does engagement in music mean to music students in higher education when they reflect on the experiences of their studies and workload? In this qualitative study, I analyzed music students' experiences of workload, which were coded as meaning of musicianship. Thus, it was a theme that I felt should be explored more deeply, because it seemed to be a topic for which the interview participants expressed lots of positive emotions. Here you can see it highlighted with yellow in the Music Student Workload Project thematic coding framework. Many of the themes related to workload emphasize the negative consequences that a difficult or unmanageable workload may result in for music students, such as overload, stress, burnout, and mental illness. When searching for ways to specifically help music students deal with their workload, previous research has shown that their meaningful engagement in music is especially worth investigating. The findings here show how music students' workload experiences in higher education are connected to their constructed meanings of engaging in music. These connections as a whole can be understood as various holistic experiences that comprise the following construct meanings of musical engagement: the students' intense and complex experiences, their development as musicians, their creative self-expression, their interactions with others, their personal growth and coping approaches, and their transcendental musical experiences. The students' emotional reactions as they spoke about the meaning of engaging in music have shown that music is a source of vitality to them, and furthermore, that one's experiences of engaging in music is a complex phenomenon that many of the participants have found difficult to describe. Here you can see an example of a music student's experience in personal growth and coping approaches. Yeah, music to me is everything. Yeah, I guess it is my life. I wouldn't be who I am today without music. The policy recommendation arising from this sub-study is that an understanding of music students' lived experiences of studying music should be utilized to improve the learning and teaching environments of institutions, and also to better support music students' well-being, learning, and future careers. And here you can find details of the article, which is at the moment in the final review stage, hopefully. So you probably can find it very soon published in the journal Research Studies in Music Education. We have now reviewed the 4 empirical sub-studies in the Music Student Workload project. I will next shortly present the systematic literature review which I conducted together with my supervisors, Dr. Guadalupe Lopez-Iniquez and Dr. Michelle Phillips. The research question was, what factors have an impact on students' workload, and what are music students' experiences of workload in relation to their studies? We conducted a systematic search of literature in 23 electronic databases and 19 music research journals, following the guidelines of PRISMA. After that, we conducted an extended meta-ethnography with 29 studies to create a synthesis that finally revealed 3 specific themes, offering a total of 28 recommendations for interventions. The policy recommendation arising from this sub-study is that interventions are needed to increase music students' ability to cope with their workload, to provide tools for teachers to support music students in managing and coping with their workload, and to develop learner-centered environments in higher music education. And here you can find details of the article, which I'm at the moment revising in the second review stage. You can already find the protocol registered in Prospero. As I mentioned earlier, there was also one theoretical sub-study in the project, and the research question was, how are equality and cultural reproduction connected to tuition fees and entrance examinations in higher music education institutions? In this study, I compare the higher music education systems in 3 different countries. I thought that there should be a critical debate about the role and impact of tuition fees and entrance examination systems in higher music education. And this discussion should be situated within an evaluation of contemporary educational policy trends. According to Anna Bull, crucial topics include social inequalities, genres, class, genders, and race, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse in the field of music, and creative collaboration with other social groups. Moreover, it is vital to listen to music students talk about their joys and concerns, such as workload, and to integrate their voices into the music institution's developmental work, addressing and sharing individual experiences of inequality and oppression in educational systems can make more inclusive education possible. The policy recommendation arising from this study is that misconceptions about equity in higher music education should be revealed to raise and maintain a critical debate about the role of tuition fee systems and as they are connected with the economics of higher education, and about entrance examinations as reproducing social class inequalities. And here you can find details of the article published in the journal Nordic Research in Music Education. The transcendental phenomenological approach was an essential method for the music student workload project. That is why I wanted to take a closer look at it in the methodological sub-study with the research question, in what ways can a transcendental phenomenological research approach offer insights into music students' lived experiences in higher education? In this sub-study, I provide a detailed description of how music students' lived experiences can be approached and analyzed through this approach in order to obtain meaningful understanding of music students' experience workload. The policy recommendation arising from this sub-study is that a practical research-based model is needed in order to address music students' experiences in relation to curricular-related improvements in a higher music education institution, such as processing and incorporating students' feedback into future administrative and teaching developments. And here you can find details of the article, which is at the moment under review. Finally, the meta-narrative of these 7 sub-studies provides actionable recommendations for interventions that will allow higher music education institutions to better support music students' abilities to cope with their workload and stress by supporting music students' proactive coping skills, finding solutions to the unequal workload and stress experiences between low-income and well-off students, genders, and study programs, ensuring teachers' professional development, particularly in the learner-centered pedagogical approaches. Interventional research in investigating music student discipline-specific experiences of workload and stress. And as a conclusion, the policy recommendation arising from the meta-narrative are: higher music education institutions should constantly gather and analyze students' experiences so that the support systems that help students cope with workload and stress work properly, both in future times of crisis and in everyday circumstances. The gathered information should function as a decision-making tool to inform the curricular, administrative, and professional development of both higher music education teachers and their students. The policy and intervention implication of this research will have an impact not only on music students' coping, learning, well-being, and future careers as musicians, but also on the preparedness of higher music education teachers and the development of more equitable and just education systems. When considering these recommendations, it's important to say a few words about the effects of the corona pandemic on students' workload, stress, and coping. Survey results indicate that the COVID-19 crisis adversely affected higher education student workloads and that the associated stress had negative effects on students' learning and well-being, such as a decrease in music students' practicing hours and an increase in their stressful thoughts and feelings. Particularly in the performing arts, the lockdown situation significantly changed students' educational processes and thus affected their everyday functioning in one-to-one tuition, practicing, performing, and exploring career paths. However, the corona pandemic also showed that the change from a more teacher-mediated method of instructing to a more learner-oriented method increased important skills in self-regulated learning and shift the source of knowledge back to the music student. In general, the COVID-19 crisis made evident the lack of effective policies and interventions to support students as they cope with their experiences of workload and stress. According to Professor Katariina Salmela-Aro at the University of Helsinki, the corona pandemic has shown that more of the decisions that are made about students should be made so that they too are listened to, as one of the three basic psychological needs is autonomy, such as opportunities for influence. All right, now it's time to finish my presentation. And it's time to thank all those university music students who participated in this study by generously sharing their experiences and time. I would also like to give very special thanks to my primary supervisor, Dr. Guadalupe Lopez Iniquez. Her deep international research experience, encouragement, and inspiration have inspired me to work hard and enjoy every step in my research process. She took me with her to the ISPS conference in Reykjavik 2017 and encouraged me to apply for this graduate award this year. My warmest thanks also goes to my other supervisors, Dr. Kai Lehikoinen and Professor Heidi Westerlund at the University of the Arts Helsinki in Finland, and Dr. Michelle Phillips at the Royal Northern College of Music in the United Kingdom. I also give my warm thanks to Dr. Christopher Denvold, who as a language editor has been a constant support in polishing my English in these articles and presentations. I'm very grateful to all of these people and organizations, which you can see here. They have been an important source of support to me during my research process. In the next slide, you can see my contact details. On my webpage, you can find all my sub-studies if you are interested in taking a closer look at them and perhaps citing them in the future. Thank you for listening to my graduate award presentation today.
Thank you so much, Tuula, for an excellent and very thought-provoking talk today. I have to say I love the fact that through your research, you learned coping mechanisms that you were then able to apply to your own life in managing the impressive achievement of a full-time job and following a doctoral path. So that was a very interesting aspect. I know there's probably lots of questions. I have some myself, and I'm going to rather open the floor to, we don't have a lot of time, but to questions. So if anybody has a question, if you could raise your hand, that would be great, and I'll try and make sure that I can see it, or write question in the chat box. Okay, am I missing anyone, Erin, that I'm not able to see?
Just me, actually.
Okay.
Tuula, thank you very much. I wanted to just to get your help potentially in solving one dilemma, but then I had one question as well.
Yes.
So with your second study, you point out that workload is a strong predictor of stress. Indeed, and the issue that I have is that we also know that we need to engage students in terms of their health and well-being, and often that means putting in new courses into the curriculum and thereby increasing their workload. So how can we get around this problem of trying to help them with things like stress when we're in fact potentially increasing the workload that they have to do in a very busy and packed schedule? And then that's my dilemma. And the question that I had for you, you mentioned as one of your final observations that it's useful to to gather and analyze students' experiences and to do this on a regular basis. I agree absolutely. And I wonder what methods and mechanisms you would actually recommend that we try to use in order to stay on top of that student experience so that we can analyze the data and then apply it back into our practices.
Yeah, I can first answer that second question. So thank you. Very good questions indeed. So actually, institutions collect lots of data from the students. And because I have been working into administration, I know what happens to that data. So I think it's misuse of students' time and their experiences when they are asked to fill in this and this and this survey, and then the administration just take a look at them and maybe show some percentage and some means, but then the data has been forgotten. So I think the institutions already have lots of good data, but they just need a good researcher, maybe like me, who can use both qualitative and quantitative methods to properly analyze. You can see how I had only 155 participants, and still I have been able to produce that much of good knowledge about that data. So I think that the institution already has the data, and the problem is that because there are so many surveys, then when the researchers collect data from the students, then then there is the problem of the low response rate because students are tired to fill in the questionnaires. But I think your question is very good, because I think that the institutional questionnaires, they actually collect opinions. So if we want to hear the students' experiences, we should conduct qualitative research on that topic, and nobody has time for that. So once again, I recommend a good researcher. But that is something what the higher education systems are not very ready to do. They are not ready to investigate to a good researcher who could take a look at and who could conduct research among students, although the students are the most important thing, of course, in the institutions. Thank you, Aaron. That is a very basic and very good question about my, and that was the question why I initially wanted to start to research this. So you are just there in the core of the thing. And your first thing was about, I already forgot it, but it was about, can you repeat it, please?
Well, only the dilemma that we face when we seek to reduce student stress and to give them tools and coping mechanisms to help them with stress. But yet we often find ourselves in a position of adding to their workload and adding to the curriculum.
Yes, and I think that the problem is more, it's deep. It's in the higher education systems, and that comes to the curriculums which are overloaded. And it's really difficult because as I showed in the first student experience, every teacher, they has their ambition and they provide high quality teaching, and they want to include this to the curriculum and this course and this course. So there is really a problem that it should be taught once again, what is a reasonable curriculum for the students. And in my, the participants also mentioned that there is so much interesting things that they know that it's a problem that they have taken too many courses, but they just cannot leave anything out. Everything is so interesting. So that's a good question, really good question too. And I think we should look at more to the higher education systems with this, and start from the academics themselves and their workload. How can they show the students good manageable workload when everybody nowadays is overloaded?
I'm going to jump in at this point. I think it's a wonderful point, and actually my questions were also around curriculum. And as you suggested, near the end, intervention should be student-centered. And one way of looking at it would be to actually add up the number of hours that all of those courses and performances and practicing really takes from the learner perspective. But I'm afraid I have to actually end the session now, because we have to move on to the next one. So I've got in my instructions. So I will just say once again, a thanks to everyone who attended the session today and who will listen to it in the recorded version, and a special congratulations and thank you so much, Tuula, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you so much, everyone.